Right, well, a little bit of East Anglia for you to have a look at, and my task in a way is to get beyond the obvious, and the obvious in many ways is things that have been said by other people about East Anglia. Now, how about that? A very common statement about East Anglia, but I hope we'll get a bit beyond that. So let's go in and talk about East Anglia. It's in the east of England, obviously, and fairly obvious that part. And I've been talking perhaps about a slightly enlarged East Anglia mainly, that normally it's thought to be Norfolk and Suffolk, but for reasons which I hope I'll make clear, that it's good to include Essex, because there's links across which we need to think about. And so I think that we need to think about borders, that there's the Waveney, which is on the border between Norfolk and Suffolk. There's the Stour, which is the border between Essex and Suffolk. But there are other rivers like this one, the Gipping, which are very important when we're thinking about other sort of boundaries. There are also various bits of East Anglia which have names, but for most of East Anglia, what's important are the claylands in the center there, that they are dominant. And if we go to geology, you can see on this map that blue color is clay. There is an awful lot of it, largely left over by the Anglian glaciation. It has left us with a great legacy. Now, I tend to put lines on maps, and so I thought I'd give you something which is a very obvious series of lines, which are really just based on me putting a cross right through East Anglia, Eastern England, in fact. But it is actually quite good for making you think of the different areas of Eastern England. For instance, you can see that the Fenland area, Wisbech, and that sort of area, Ely, is in one quarter. There is a lot of Norfolk and North Suffolk in the second quarter, Southeast Suffolk in the third, and then you've got a very more mixed area down in the other quarter toward Royston and areas like that. I'll make use of this series of lines elsewhere just to sort of bring you back so you can think of what the soils are underneath things, because soils are important in how it sets up the character of an area. And for instance, this one, which is a modern map of soil quality. So obviously the fens stand out there as an area of grade 1 soils. And you can see if I put my lines back, you can see that these lines seem to fit together, that interestingly, a lot of Norfolk is actually lower quality land.
I can't see anything, can I?
A lot of Essex is higher quality land. And if we put back soils, you can see how these things fit together. And we get an idea of the link between the resources behind the landscape. Now, one of the things which also comes into play is whether it is all flat. I started off with that comment by Noel Coward about Norfolk being flat. Well, parts of East Anglia aren't that flat. This is an interesting way of looking at the landscape, and the areas with very pale yellow, almost white, are flat. And that means there's poor drainage. And on clay, that's not a good idea. If you have the red colors, it means that you do have slopes. And on clay, that means the water gets off and you have higher quality land for crops, arable crops. And so it does make a difference. And if you look at this, this is the soil grading again, and you can see that the high quality grade 1 or grade 2 land is to the south, where you do have slopes. Where you have the worst flat lands, you have the lower quality land. And it fits in with what we know, that if you have poorly drained land, you can grow grass. Therefore, you can have cows and you can have dairying. And this is Arthur Young's dairying region of Suffolk showing up in that area. On the other hand, if you have drained land, you can have arable crops. You want buildings to store all your wonderful crops. And so aisled barns, these barns which have an extra bit of space, where do you find them? You find in the opposite area to Arthur Young's dairying region in Suffolk. They are down in the southwest of the county. Very few go into that northeast side. And it has an effect on what we might find. For instance, this is the dialect word for a cattle house, cow house, and a nettus in Suffolk. Most of the dialect evidence is from that northern area. So I'll just go back one. That this is Tom Williamson's version of this map of varying heights. And you can see that it fits with this idea of the soil types. So if I go backwards and forwards, you can see there the darker colors at the bottom where you've got more slope, and therefore the soils are better. And so it's something which we see across the whole of our eastern region. When it comes to thinking also about how you organize your land, field systems, there is something which is different in East Anglia to the Midland areas of England. That this is the field systems work done by Gray in the early 20th century. And you can see in the central parts of England, you have the best evidence for common field agriculture. On the east side and on the west side, there's very little evidence for it. And it makes a difference to how you organize your landscape. And it also fits in with what sort of settlements you have, that you have nucleated settlements in that central area, and you have dispersed settlements on either side. So you get common fields and villages coming in one area, which is in that central area of England, and more dispersed settlement on either side. And most of East Anglia is in the dispersed settlement area. And there you can see from this one, putting them all in one, you can see Gray's area of common fields and the area of basically nucleated settlements. And if you come to look in more detail, you'll see that that area, that central England type of landscape only just comes into the very west of our region. That it affects Cambridgeshire, Hertfordshire, and only the very edge of Suffolk, Norfolk. You see, Norfolk is slightly different. A few years ago, I did a study of field systems in East Anglia, which came out in East Anglian archaeology, looking at the difference over the region. And this map shows you how much common field you find across our region. And you can see in Norfolk, there is quite a lot. In Suffolk, in parts, there is some. And then you get down to Essex, and there's very little. And so you have a change in the way the landscape is organized. I also got involved in landscape characterization, trying to put polygons on a map which indicated different types of landscapes. You don't have to understand most of what all these colors mean, but basically yellow means late enclosure, and most of the red colors means early or ancient landscape. And you can see it does fit with what we know about parliamentary enclosure. Those red dots on that map indicate areas where we know there was a parliamentary enclosure of open fields, common land. And I tried to expand the idea of what you could characterize of the landscape into Essex and to a certain extent up into Norfolk, based on those same sort of ideas. And came up with some trend lines, which I tried to extend. So this one shows those trend lines, but also where we have evidence for parliamentary enclosure. And you can see there is an area in Norfolk which has quite a lot in Cambridgeshire and in Hertfordshire, but very little over most of Suffolk and Essex, indicating a different sort of landscape. And came up with this version of the map showing different types of landscapes. Very important really in this is to notice that what I've called the Kipping divide, which separates the northern part of Suffolk from the south part of Suffolk. That South Suffolk seems to have more in common with Essex, and North Suffolk seems to link in with Norfolk. For somebody who lives in Suffolk, this is quite awkward because it seems to imply you have a greater Norfolk and a greater Essex, and Suffolk is somewhere cut off in between, but it does make a difference in what goes on. I just put that back again, just so you can see how it might relate to soil types underneath. This is Tom Williamson's version, really, of what I was trying to do, that this is showing importance of different types of field enclosure. And so you have blue rectilinear field patterns indicating planned enclosure, what is usually a parliamentary enclosure. You have red, which is early enclosure, you could call ancient enclosure. There's white, which is very similar, really, direct enclosure from a wasteland, but giving us similar patterns. Purple means that you've got both, you can't decide what's really going on. And yellow, it hasn't got any boundaries anyway. So that's the open heath areas. And if you put my map against Tom's, you see there actually is quite a lot of similarity in what we saw, that you do have a difference running through central Suffolk. There is something going on, which is not what we expected. How do we explain it? Well, you can come up with all sorts of ideas. One idea might be that it is something to do with who owns the land. That here we have two of the major Domesday estates in Suffolk, one which is in the north, which is Robert Mallett's estate, and then you have the Clares down in the south. And you can see, sorry, just for reasons known to itself, it keeps wanting to go on. Anyway, just there are various reasons why this might have happened, and because your feudal background might imply that you are having to go to certain market centres or something like that. So it might influence where you actually have craftsmen, etc. The other thing which we have in our region, which is very strong, is moated sites. And we have one of the strongest concentrations of moated sites in England. And this is an old map. We now have, perhaps with Essex, the greatest number of moats in England. And they are part of the landscape. Here you can see they are obviously very closely linked to the clay areas. It's obvious because you need a clay soil to keep the water in. And so it's people taking advantage of their soil types to put in something which expresses their status mainly. And some of them are like this early site linked to earlier hall and church complexes, which may go back into the late Saxon period. Some are just showing off with very grand houses, but it's a way of showing status in the landscape. And it is something which is very important across Eastern England. We also have things called greens, and they again are very closely linked to the clay. And you can see the outline of the clay there again, and all those green spots are greens, and they have a particular place in the landscape. here you can see at Wingfield that the greens are all really on the flatter bits of the landscape. They are where you have problems with drainage, and these have been left to one side and have become greens. That in the valleys where there's better land, you tend to find the churches and the main manor halls. And so these are usually a secondary element in the landscape. And here's a Wingfield green, and you can see this isn't the sort of cricket playing green of central England, perhaps. This is a grazing green, and it has typically houses dotted around its margin. And this map shows interfluves, the areas between the main drainage. And this is where most of the big greens can be found, that they are linked to areas with problems with undrained soils. And so you can grow grass on them, you have a green. Now there's a particular group of greens called ties that I'm showing the Suffolk ones. Unfortunately, there isn't a map for Essex, which would continue them. It's an interesting group that it is a word for a green, and it has a particular distribution that for some reason it doesn't really go beyond the gipping. That in northeast Suffolk, they don't use this term. They have very similar greens, but they don't use this term tie. And here you can see lots of ties all over this bit of South Suffolk. You've got Battersford tie, Charles tie, Barking tie, and Moats tie. In the same area, you also have something called green. So it is just a use of a particular term, but a term which only occurs in some areas. What we can dismiss at this stage are things like crux, that the whole of Eastern England seems to be outside the area. And so in terms of building types, it's something which doesn't really come into us. But we do have crown posts. And this is where we start wanting more data, because this, for instance, is a very old article showing the distribution of crown posts. And it seems to be implying that our line along the gipping might have been important. And it may still turn out to be of some importance, but as we get more data, we understand things become slightly different. So here, for instance, is a better map of crown posts, and you can see it actually goes beyond where the 1960s data seem to indicate. And you can see here that it is actually a much wider distribution. This is where we need more data. We need more data to map things in Norfolk and to map things in Essex, so we can actually build up patterns better. At the moment, we're using rather old data. A very interesting group are ones which are queen post roofs, because this is a very good roof construction, and it's something which is possible you can use it in any area, but for, again, uncertain reasons, it is found in northeast Suffolk, and it doesn't appear to cross our boundary at the gipping, or hardly crosses it, indicating that what we saw as a boundary for other reasons is reappearing in our building types. And so it is an interesting question when we look together with ties, for instance, that we can see that they are exclusive almost, that you have ties in one area and you have queen post roofs in the other. And if you want to be funny about it, there you go, Queensland and Thailand, two different areas of Suffolk. That gipping divide is actually curious because it indicates that there are different schools of carpentry going on. So as well as having the different sorts of roofs we saw, they do slightly different things to do with the braces, for instance. whether you have it going up or coming down, where you put things like cross wings or don't have them, and where you put inserted hearths. These are all very interesting differences between the two areas. Again, some of the reasons of these are unclear, and we need more data to understand them. There are things which are later that are also showing rather similar distributions. For instance, this is Pantile Roofs, which are very much a feature of the northern area, but hardly again cross the Gipping line. So there's a difference there. The idea is that these may have come across from Holland originally, and so we do see them very much in the east, and certainly the ones with the black glaze are more common along the east side. Again, we could have a lot more data on this. I'm not sure quite where Tom Williamson, who did this map, got all his data from, whether it's based on just a general idea or actual data. So we can see that there are reasons for thinking of this landscape and its different elements. And I'm going to finish really by looking at individual places in terms of where you place your house and where you place your barns. So we're going to look at a few different places across these different types of landscapes. And to start with, this is an excavated site in Norfolk, and we're looking to see there is a house and there is a house, as far as we can tell from the excavated evidence. And what is interesting is where you see B in the front, that is the barn. And so we have the houses behind the barns. So there's a road in front and a green, and houses behind the barn. If we go to Thuxton, we have the same sort of thing. There's the house, there's a barn in front, and then a road. This is Ampton, and we can see on this rather nice map that there's a house, 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 house. And again, you can see that there is a barn in front in each case. And here at Elmswell, again, a very nice map with a rather nice shepherd and his sheep. But there's the house, and again, there's a barn building in front. This is Hitcham. Here we have the house and the barns at the back. We know it's an early house, so you can see it's actually got a crown post roof. This is also in Hitcham, and there's the house. It doesn't look like much, but you go inside and there's remains of an open hall with a crown post. The question is, why? Why is there a difference? And this may be because of how you organize your fields. If you have common fields and you have strips, it means that you have strips in different areas. So to get to your land, you go outside, you go by a road. If you bring your crop back, you bring it back by road. Therefore, it makes sense to have your barn in the front. If you are living in the areas where you have all your land in a block around you, which is what you find in southern areas, South Suffolk and Essex, if you're going into your fields, you go usually through your own land. And therefore, when you bring your crop back, you bring it back again through your own land. And therefore, it makes sense to have your barn at the back. You don't go out particularly by road. And this could be the important point, why you get this difference between where you place your buildings in your holdings. And it will actually alter the character of your settlements, because one will show a lot of barns along roads, the other one will show a lot of houses. And this is something to do with how you organize your landscape. So I hope in this very brief talk, I've given you some ideas of why there is more to East Anglia, Eastern England, than just it's very flat. It is actually very interesting, and there are all sorts of complex things going on which influence where we put our buildings and even what sort of buildings we have. So I will leave you at that point. If you want to read more about what I've been trying to explain, there is this chapter I've done in this book, which I understand is coming out in paperback this year. So hopefully you will be able to find a copy somewhere and read up about what I've been going on about. And I'll stop share at that point.